So it's time we take a look at even more excellent hidden weapons you can find in Elden Ring. The ones we're going to go over today are great at stunning enemies, have excellent reach, look really awesome, and you definitely don't want to miss them. Oh, and speaking of things you don't want to miss out, totally check out GOG.com using my links down below. All of their games are DRM free, there's some really huge discounts happening right now, and it's a win-win for everybody as this also helps the channel out. Coming up to number 5, we have the Godskin Stitcher, a heavy thrusting sword with an excessively high reach and one of the best heavy attacks if you're looking for a quick stun. You get this from the Godskin Noble at the Temple of Glaive after getting abducted underneath the academy and getting transported beneath the volcano manor. It requires 14 points into strength and 17 into dexterity, but you can build this in all sorts of ways. I really enjoyed coupling this with a faith or an intelligence hybrid, but you can also go like full dex if you want to. If you pair this with a thunderbolt, you can totally pick the lightning affinity and lean more into dexterity, which is going to give you that extra damage, and also the Ash of War, having that cast from really far away. I also like switching things up. If you want to go with Keen, it definitely works, and you can couple this with an electrify armament while still keeping the thunderbolt for ranged damage. But its cherry on top is obviously the charged heavy, basically doing 2 consecutive pokes, very similar to the ones that the Godskin boss is doing against you, and usually it doesn't take too long to literally stun anything. Even some of these bosses that normally shouldn't be stunned by mere pokes definitely get stunned eventually. You can bring it one step further though and make it into the ultimate stun weapon if you combine this with a glintstone pebble Ash of War and put it with a cold affinity. This is for anybody who's using an intelligence hybrid. This is going to give you the huge massive stun from the pebble and the follow-up R2, and then you can combo that into a charge R2 to really ensure those stuns. If anything survives, it's likely going to get fully stunned, and by the time you do a critical strike, a frostbite should also proc for even more burst of damage. It also pairs well with shields if you want to play like that and want to include riposte in your arsenal. It's definitely a nice early on option. Coming up to number 4, we have the really awesome looking Nightrider's Glaive, and an awesome option if you're going with a full Knights Cavalry kind of setup. You get this from the horseman you encounter during the night on the road from the East Rea Lucaria gate right here on this side of the map. It requires 26 into strength and 10 into dexterity, but it only gets a max scaling into strength, especially if you put a heavy affinity on it. But it also gets a B scaling if you go with a lightning infusion. Both of these can work, and honestly it's one of the coolest weapons if you want to go in and buff them both with some extra damage and also have a non-magical Ash of War on it. In this case, I totally enjoyed that blade dance. I think it suits it very well. It gives it a very long reach since it's an already very long weapon, and it also has some really high damage, especially if you spec a lot more into strength. I especially enjoyed this with the running R1. This is going to perform a fast poke, and usually what you can do is to then follow up with a weapon special or the Ash of War that you applied on it. The standing R1 also comes out fast, and it's great at interrupting enemies. It kind of does these knocks that interrupt pretty much anything, and usually it's not much that the enemy can do against you. It can also knock enemies out of the air in case they jump, but honestly this is just an overall good looking weapon with a good reach that deals very high damage if spec'd properly. Coming up to number 3, the next one is the Rotten Greataxe. This requires, strangely enough, 30 points into strength and 10 into dexterity, even though technically speaking at max level 25 it gets a better scaling into dexterity for some reason. So I think you can build this either way regardless, but you get this from the Rotten Duelist on the cliff right next to the town of Ordina, right here in the mountaintops on the right side of that town. This is another excellent rot build-up weapon that can be infused with other Ashes of War without losing its passive status effect, but there is one exception, and that is if you apply a bleed affinity. For some reason it makes the weapon to completely drop its rot build-up. Not sure if it's an oversight or if it's intentional. I think it's the only weapon that does so, but this leaves room for going with a poison infusion and maybe coupling that with a Kindred Lord Exaltation Talisman. If you power stance these, I recommend then going with a second one and choosing a cold affinity for extra damage explosions, build up, and of course those defense reductions. If you want to take full advantage of the poisoned and especially the rot build up, I heavily encourage you to invest some more points into arcane, otherwise enemies will simply die off way before you even get to trigger one rot build up. But against bosses it definitely triggers way faster. You can also use two of them with a jumping L1. Not only does it deal very high damage, can stun enemies, but the build up is also excellent, and eventually it will completely eat out the bosses. There's two more weapons left though, and the next one is the Beastclaw Greathammer, given to you by Gorang after turning in the 7th death root in his questline and also kind of defeating him in the process. So here it goes. You can find 4 of these really easily by defeating the 4 Tibia Mariners in 4 spots on the map. One of them in the Summon Water Village. There's a second one in the East Liurnia of the Lakes location right here on this side of the map. A third one in the Windham Ruins once you make your way to the Altus Plateau, and finally in the mountaintops there's one nearby the Castle Soul main gate. But there's 3 more that you will need on top of these, so this includes one in the Death Touch Catacombs after finishing the end boss, another one in the Black Knife Catacombs after the end boss, and finally another one in the Gilmer's Hero Grave. Now once you get this, it's going to require 20 strength and 10 dexterity plus 18 faith, so you kind of have to be a hybrid to use this, and also the special weapon attack deals holy damage. Now the Regal Beastclaw weapon skill slams the hammer in the ground and also causes 5 slicing waves to spawn right in front of you, which is actually really awesome compared to something like, well, a Blasphemous Blade that only covers a very narrow line that travels very far away. So even though this is not going to have the same reach, it is going to be better maybe at roll catching enemies or just enemies that tend to dodge a lot. It's a pretty good option if you go with a strength/faith hybrid. If you want to go full bestial incantation build, it's totally an option, and it kind of fits the theme really well if you especially combine this with a Stone of Gorang. Its main advantage is the spread. As I've said, the slicing waves do cover a pretty large area and they also deal some nice damage, but only if you take full advantage of every single buff and every single talisman that buffs holy damage or weapon arts in general. Once you do that, it is going to deal over 2k damage, and I think it's a pretty awesome option. And finally, this brings us to number 1, and that's going to be the Bastard Stars. After defeating Astel past the Lake of Rot, you can get that boss remembrance and then trade it at the Round Table Hold, and instead of getting the Ash of War, just get the weapon instead. The requirements are 8 strength, 22 dex, and 22 intelligence, and the weapon skill is called Nebula. This performs a similar sweep attack like Astel that leaves a trail of explosive clouds and stars behind you, but that can stack for some really high damage. It's definitely best when coupled with a high intelligence build, and with those 22 points into dex, this is going to both meet that minimum requirement and also give you some much needed extra cast speed on top. It's totally viable to use this with a staff in the other hand and maybe follow up with some other spells if you want to, maybe a quick cast with a comet or something, but personally I just like using the weapon art and just chaining this since it deals so much damage. This is great against large hitbox enemies. Since there's plenty of them in the boss category, you can totally just annihilate them really quickly, but against some of the smaller enemies with, well, small hitboxes, it's probably not going to be ideal, which is why I'm going to want to switch maybe to the staff. But against groups of enemies, it can be a pretty good solution since you can hit multiple targets in a pretty wide area. I really enjoy coupling this with the Full Moon over Nala and maybe a Physic Magic Potion, since that gives you a whole 45% damage increase to magical damage against that target. I think it's a really nice option to start with at the beginning of the fight and then following up with the Bastard Stars. But totally let me know down below how many of these have you found so far and which one of them did you use the most. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video at any point, a thumbs up on it would be greatly appreciated, and if you really enjoyed it, then a subscribe and activating that notification bell would go a long way. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.